Hi. I am very, very honored to be here. I'm very flattered to be here. And I'm going to have to tell my father that there's more than two people who have read something I've written now. So thank you. All right. Thank you, of course, to the IHRA members, the conference host for inviting me, and really thank you for all being here. I really am flattered, but I'm going to stop on that note because I know I have exactly 35 minutes. So here's what I'm going to talk about today. I'm going to argue that there are some general propositions derived from empirical research, but on the off chance that you've had a really good lunch and a really good breakfast, and I know you've all had these great sessions this morning, in case you fall asleep, I'm going to give you the propositions first and then support them with empirical evidence, although in fact they go backwards, right? They're derived from the evidence. And then I want to position those claims or those arguments within the larger research tradition and argue for particular kinds of research on Holocaust education going forwards. If at any time I'm incoherent, don't be shy. I'm looking at you, Shoshana. Like, raise your hand, say that doesn't make any sense. Really. Okay, so here are the three propositions that I'm starting from. The first is that curricular framings of national narratives require interrogating. And I heard that all morning long, that regardless of what national context, what nationalist narratives are framing what happens in schools, the way in which the Holocaust is taught, the way in which it's curricularized, that those need to be challenged. Because I come from doing research in the US context, what I can tell you is that sometimes those framings, they're not state-mandated or nationalist mandates, but they tend to work into the curriculum in more implicit ways. My argument is that those kinds of framings, and here I'm not just talking about nationalist agendas, but any sort of particularist goals that we use Holocaust to teach, those need to be surfaced and they need to be interrogated. We need to sort of discuss the moral dimensions of them. The second proposition is that student values that are attached to Holocaust learning, to teaching and learning about the Holocaust, so this applies to teachers as well, but I especially want us to focus on student learning, but that the student values attached to those meanings need to be surfaced, and ideally they need to be surfaced in school settings. And again, this comes from my context in the US, where we have exceedingly segregated living patterns and essentially segregated schools vis-a-vis wealth. So depending on where you live in the US, there are very different kinds of places you can go to school. But generally speaking, there are only particular places where people of different political values, of different religions, of different socioeconomic classes, although less so that, interact, and those are school sites. So I want to argue that any student values, any moral meanings that are attached to Holocaust learning and really attached to any morally weighty historical events, those need to be surfaced in school so that they can be challenged, so that they can be discussed, and that's partly because we're then utilizing what school is for, as far as I'm concerned. And the third proposition is really, Monique asked me to focus a little bit on classrooms, and most of my research has been very, very much classroom-based. So I was trying to think of what's a proposition derived from research that would get us to what it looks like to have really rich student engagement in classes. And a really kind of shorthand way to do that, a kind of shortcut way to do that, would be to say that the intellectual work of class time, from my perspective, and again, it's very American-driven, ought to be dominated by student discourse. So that is, if I believe that we ought to be surfacing student understandings in classrooms or in informal settings, then the discourse that shows up in classroom ought to be majority student generated, not teacher talked. Does that make sense? Okay, so that's great. So right now you can just go to sleep. I'm done. So just for those of you who aren't the four people in the room who've read my work, I'm just going to give you a very quick overview of the kind of research I do and where these propositions come from. The research I do has been in American classrooms. It's mostly been in formal K-12 settings, kindergarten through 12th grade. And I try to do ethnographic case studies where I really stay close to what are the teachers doing in the class. I try to interview students and the teachers before the class unit on the Holocaust. I interview kids and students as the class goes on. I interview them at the end. I collect all class materials. I observe everything in the class. And I always aim for best case. I don't really like that lingo, but what I mean by that is I'm trying not to look at people who are doing things badly. I'm trying to set us up to look at instantiations of practice that are really powerful models and that can show us what good work looks like, recognizing always that the work of teaching is incredibly complex. I also always want to go for best case scenarios, in part because in the U.S. we're having a tremendous backlash against teachers. Teachers are blamed for everything in dominant U.S. discourse at the moment. It's basically a proxy for why can't you fix poverty, but that's a side note. In this talk I'm going to use data from 4 different studies, or maybe it's 6. I'm kind of curious about how those empirical studies were counted from this morning. I don't know how to count them exactly, but it's a good question, right? I did a study that compares public school teaching, third graders who are about 7 or 8 years old learning about the Holocaust for the first time. I actually have long-term research on that project too. 12 years later, what do the third graders in that class remember? And then I'm mostly going to focus on religious middle schoolers for this talk, partly because they really help me get to these propositions, all of which are empirically based. Okay, so let's just review for a quick moment. That first proposition is that curricular framings of the Holocaust reflecting national narratives or really any particularist goals require interrogating rather than replicating. And I could make this argument based solely on politics, right? I could make the argument that we need to do this in classrooms simply on the basis of the ways in which the Holocaust is used in political discourse. I know that is not news for anybody here, but just as a side note, Ben Carson, who is running for the Republican ticket to be the presidential nominee, to be the Republican presidential nominee in the U.S. elections, makes this comparison that if only people had been armed during the Holocaust, it wouldn't have happened, right? So you can make political arguments about the usages of the Holocaust that require us to surface their meanings in classrooms. And even if what I want to say is that whether you agree or disagree with the politics, so let's say you want to make the argument that the memory of the Holocaust or learning about the Holocaust really ought to be mobilized towards preventing genocide, I want to surface all of those kinds of political agendas, whether we agree with them or don't agree with them, as ways for the basis of discussion. This proposition comes basically out of the very first study I did a long time ago now, in which I was examining a Facing History and Ourselves teacher who was an amazingly gifted teacher, who was very well trained, very well loved, and who essentially in a semester-long elective unit taught about the Holocaust in a way whereby the actors involved were making independent decisions, and they were sort of rugged individuals overcoming adversity. And the narrative that was constructed over an entire semester, he meant to use to empower his students, who were largely minority students, and he wanted them to make great decisions in their own lives. And many of those students reported being morally infused and empowered by the class. But it's not really a Holocaust, it's not, what's the word I want? It's not particularly resonant with most historical versions of the Holocaust, right? We don't tend to think of this as a story of rugged individualism. It's a very American meta-narrative. It had a kind of happy ending, a very substantial silver lining in the sense that he ended with the units on rescuers. So it's not surprising that a student in that class, after a full semester elective, when asked, and I always ask in interviews, why do you think the Holocaust happened, or why do you think Jews were persecuted, why do you think Roma were persecuted, what groups do you think were involved? So this student said to me, well, I really don't understand how you all let yourselves be gassed like that. And it's not surprising, right? Because she couldn't understand group behavior given that the individualistic framing oriented her towards neither understanding totalitarianism nor how you explain these kinds of events. So that meta-narrative, in my context, generally speaking, is not one that people are asking teachers to teach. It's one that infuses a curricular orientation by virtue of the fishbowl we live in, or can at any rate. So here's a second proposition that comes out of that, right, which is that I don't want students, and this isn't just because I believe in anti-authoritarianism, it's also because I want students to have the skill sets in order to engage those really complex narratives and to see outside of the fishbowls that they grow up in. So if my second proposition is that not only those sort of overarching nationalist frames or teacher-generated meanings ought to be challenged, I also want student values attached to the Holocaust surfaced. And it's partly the fishbowl problem. It's partly because we don't see outside of ourselves. And it's partly because when we line up contrasting, competing, contested narratives, we have much more power to navigate them, I think. And I'm not in any way suggesting that that's easy. I'm only suggesting that we ought to do that. And some of the discussions I heard this morning, which were really fabulous and interesting, suggested that, there are certain narratives that can't be aligned or compared, that they're parallel narratives that we're not. And I worry about that deeply because I think that when we argue that contrasts can't be made or comparisons can't be drawn, what we're really saying is that there's only one narrative. And what we really want students to be able to do, and people to be able to do, is say, this narrative comes from this historical experience, this narrative comes from this historical experience, what's the evidence, what are the usages of this history? So in the US, one of the things that doesn't get talked about very much, although there's a lot of competing research about this, are students' religious orientations and the religious meanings that they bring into the classroom. And that's partly because religion is a specially protected category constitutionally in the US. Our First Amendment puts religion in a constitutionally different category than some other categories of identity. But it's also meant that public school teachers in particular have been historically somewhat nervous to talk about students' religious identities or their religious meanings. So there's a bunch of research that suggests that when students' religious identities and religiously oriented meanings come to the fore in classrooms, teachers prefer to kick it out of the classroom. That's a great question to ask your rabbi, or a great question to talk with your parents about. And while the U.S. is an exceedingly diverse country, religiously, ethnically, exceedingly diverse, if you look at it in terms of percentages, it's actually a sort of moderately, it has a moderate level of religious diversity when you think about the percentages of folks in the U.S. So I bring that up because it means that students who have religiously imbued worldviews know and learn not to bring them up in school. So we have lots of research on how students with religious convictions don't bring it to the fore in public schools, and it's the sort of classic tension between what you really know versus what your teacher's saying, or what understandings you perform for the sake of the test versus what you really believe. So in a public school, also in that first study on high schools I did, I was interviewing a Catholic young woman and asked her, how do you understand why the Holocaust happened? And though she wouldn't have said this in class and didn't say this in class, this is what came up in the interview. She said, in my eyes, I look at it and I go, why was it supposed to happen, meaning the Holocaust? It was written just like it's destiny, The past was already written. They couldn't change it. They said that the Son of God was going to die, so that's the way it was supposed to be. Well, I'm Catholic, but after I think about it, it was our fault for killing the Jews. But it was their fault for killing Jesus. It was all already written. So that's a notion of history that's preordained. It's not a particularly surprising one from where I come. But it's one that doesn't live in the discourse of public American schools, and it's one that I want surfaced in classrooms so that it can be challenged, so that it can be discussed. And I believe strongly, this is maybe, there are folks who would think this is nuts, but I really believe strongly that that schools ought to be places where we discuss our deeply held, most valued positions. It's not a place where those ought to be taken outside. So, in part because of that, students' unearthed discussions, the next studies I did on middle schools were in fundamentalist middle schools. And I know some people would argue that Jewish schools oughtn't be called fundamentalist schools, but for the purposes of this presentation, I'm going to call them fundamentalist schools. I did a study in an 8th grade, which are 13 or 14-year-olds, in a charismatic evangelical fundamentalist Christian school, and in an ultra-Orthodox Jewish girls' yeshiva, a girls' Jewish school. There's some similarities and differences between those two worlds. Some of the similarities are that they're both very insular communities. The fundamentalist Christian kids went to the same school from kindergarten through high school, and yet the fundamentalist Christian kids would buy food and other items from non-Christians. The ultra-Orthodox Jewish community is more insular, but they're really both sociologically total worlds, and they both have very particular kinds of relationships to sacred texts, what it looks like to argue, what it looks like to be taught. And in both places, they learned about the Holocaust in 8th grade. Can you hear this? Am I too loud, too quiet, too fast, too slow? All right. Here's from the Jewish school, and I'm calling that as a shorthand. This is the Lubavitcher Girls Yeshiva. But in this Jewish school, the girls learned about the Holocaust from a memoir. It's a Jewish man's memoir, Adam Starkov. If you look at him, you know that he's not an ultra-Orthodox Jew. And because his memoir is not an ultra-Orthodox Jewish text, or the memoir of an ultra-Orthodox Jew, it was censored highly. So any mentions of the contact between the sexes or anything that these girls aren't supposed to be exposed to was censored out. And so there's a way in which he was sort of made into a faux Orthodox Jew, even though, of course, the girls knew he wasn't. I want to just mention that these girls were deeply, deeply engaged. They read rapaciously. They begged to read every day it wasn't covered. They didn't object to the censorship of the text. They really actually enjoyed it. They were kind of pleased when they found something that should have been censored and it wasn't. And that the teacher's response to very serious historical questions that came up, like why were Jews put in ghettos, or why is this happening, the teacher would often answer with this remark. She'd say, "Don't say because, there was no because." And essentially she was closing down these kinds of historical questions because she didn't want there to be theological questions raised in this study of history. So that meant that these girls didn't have historical understandings of this period or social psychological understandings of this period, or even why, there were all kinds of questions they had that weren't allowed to be asked, that were shut down in the class, which meant that when you asked them, why did this happen, their background narratives, supplied by their religious orientations, of course, flooded in, and even though this wasn't discussed in class, is the orientation they bring to the text they're learning. So when you ask, why did this happen to Jews, they say, well, because we're the chosen nation and everyone's always jealous of us, and the Germans weren't normal. There's no normal reason anybody would do that. I don't know how you react to this, but I'm going to assume you react similarly to me as Holocaust educators. This is this notion of the non-normalcy of perpetrators is not a particularly healthy orientation to learning about genocide. It isn't, I don't have to say more about that. I think we're all on the same page about that. So look at how similar it is in a fundamentalist Christian school. It looks very different. The kids look very different. There are boys and girls together. They're wearing different outfits. In the Jewish girls' school, there's a lot of talk. In the Christian school, there's not very much talk. There's a religiously driven pedagogy which asks for short answers, which is symbolic of your obedience to authority and your obedience to religious leaders and your trust in them. So in that school, they read Corrie ten Boom's memoir, The Hiding Place. Have any of you read that? Have many of you read this? It's among fundamentalist Christians in the U.S., it is a required text. Among many Christians in the U.S., it's an oft-read work. It's had over 3 million printings by now. It's the story of a rescuer, but it really doesn't talk much about rescue even. It talks mostly about turning to Jesus in times of crisis. So, and that's actually why it's chosen. That's why it's meant to be a kind of manual for how to handle suffering. It is not meant to be a universalistic humanitarian text. So when the kids in the class asked the teacher that I was observing, well, what happened to the Jews? Because the Jews in this narrative just actually fall out. She hides 6 Jews in the clock shop. She and her sister get arrested. And you actually never find out what happened to the Jews. It's really about Corrie ten Boom's faith. So the teacher said in that class, well, we really don't find that out, do we? And I mean, that just tells you sort of what matters in this story. And so again, the students, when you ask them, well, why do you think this happened? Their background narratives, their religious narratives come in to explain what they're not understanding from their school-based context. So this is a very, very oft-repeated orientation, which is that Jews were martyred. They'd learned about Christians being martyred because of professing their faith. So they apply that here, even though we know historically that's not accurate, nor is it even accurate, by the way, about the memoir. This is where your background narrative is trumping what's in the memoir, because in the anyway, I digress. Here's what the student said. The Jews, they died because of their faith, because they said they believed in God, like the old Christians who said they believed in God, and then they were nailed on the cross or burnt or whatever. They said they believed in God, and then they died for it. Okay, so that brings me to the idea that in a public sphere, we need to surface those meanings. We need to be able to dialogue about those meanings, even if we're not going to agree about whether I'm going to be saved by Jesus or not. So that gets me to the third proposition, which may, to me these make sense in order. I don't know if they do to you. But the third proposition is essentially this, that if we're looking as people who are doing research in classrooms, people who are designing curricula, people who are thinking about what student discourse would look like, I think one of the things we need to really value and look for is the majority of time spent in student discourse. So when I think about that, I think about the intellectual work of schooling ought to be done by kids while they're wherever we have them. So I don't in any sense mean to dismiss teachers. I actually think it's the better, harder, more creative work that teachers do to structure those experiences and activities for students to have dispositional changes, to have to do intellectual work, and that it's actually incredibly hard teaching and incredibly good teaching. In the US, we tend to do that more in elementary schools than in secondary schools. We tend to make more room for student activity, or we tend to view students less as receptacles and more as engagers at the younger grades. So that proposition is essentially a proxy proposition, right? It's not. I'm not saying that we always need to see, when we look in teachers' classrooms, we always need to see students talking and teachers should never talk or anything like that. It's more like a proxy proposition in the sense that when we do large-scale surveys in the US, and we can't ask kids about how much money their parents make, because we know that kids in poverty know that information, but kids above poverty don't know that information. And more than that, most kids in the US, when you ask them how much do your parents make, or how much is, what socioeconomic class are you, they'll almost all say middle class. That's regardless of whether they're living in poverty, living in the middle class, living in the upper middle class, or living in the high reaches of the upper middle class. Everybody will say I'm middle class. So on large-scale surveys, you can't ask kids, what do your parents make? But we want to know. So what you ask kids on surveys is, what's your mother's highest level of educational attainment? Because you'll know whether your mother graduated from 8th grade or from high school or had some college or graduated from college. And that's the best proxy for socioeconomic class. So what I'm saying about this proposition is that it's a proxy for the kind of intellectual work we're asking of kids. So if I want a classroom where student understandings are mined and are going to be questioned and interrogated, then I want a place that's rich in student discourse. So you can actually even look at this, and maybe people here have studied this, but you can look actually at the ratio of teacher to student talk as a really good indicator, and that's the kind of thing you can't ask teachers about. You can't say, what kind of discussion do you have in your class? Because it's the socially acceptable answer is, we have great discussion and we have lots of it. But in fact, when you do research in classrooms, you find out that for many teachers, what constitutes a conversation is 3 turns of talk. So if I say, derived, what do you think about blah, 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 blah? And you say, blah, 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 blah. And I say, yes. That's considered a conversation. That is a very, very low bar for discussion. You know, that is unbelievably low. That's like, I think on average it's 2.7 seconds, right? It's not, we're not talking about robust discussion for anyway, in lots of surveys. So, and if you want the research on that, Adam Gammeren has a great piece, and Lynn Nystrand, I think. Anyway, so what I'm saying is, we can't just ask teachers about what's their proportion of talk or how, do students talk. We really need to help them generate talk. Okay, so here's just another. So I did this study of 3rd graders in a public school, and the reason I did the study is partly because I had heard lots of talk about how because teachers in public schools feel so strongly about the Holocaust's importance, which I'm sure we can all agree on in this room, they were taking it up in their curriculum at earlier and earlier grades. And so I wanted to look in an early elementary school classroom to see what gets taught, what do kids learn, and what do their parents think about it. And this is just a very small snapshot of that study, but the reason I'm bringing it up is because even in this 3rd grade, and I only sort of thought about this in preparation for this talk, but even in this 3rd grade, the kind of moral understandings, the kind of complexities came up beautifully in this 3rd grade classroom, and it's partly because the teacher was masterful and elicited lots of talk. And simultaneously, there are sort of sweet things about being an 8-year-old that don't get surfaced, right? What do kids say in classrooms? What do they not say? So one 3rd grader in that class had recently been diagnosed with ADD, which is attention deficit disorder, which is overdiagnosed in the U.S. and is highly medicated. Yeah, I don't know what it is. What is it in a different language? I don't. Attention deficit disorder. In the U.S. especially, it's much more diagnosed among minority kids and poor kids. So anyway, here's a small white 8-year-old who's just been diagnosed with attention deficit disorder, and guess what she learns about? I bet you can guess. The concentration camps. And guess what she thinks? She thinks, I thought concentration camps were places you had to go to think really hard, like to learn how to concentrate. So I don't bring that up only for the sort of humor value, but because of what we don't end up mining when we don't have enough, when we don't, get our deeply held fears, nervousness, the emotional / moral / human dimensions of the information. Okay. So here are some challenges to those 3 propositions. And they're big challenges. One challenge to this understanding of Holocaust education is that I think it really does put a much higher burden on teachers because it requires more teacher training, not less. It requires a lot more skill in developing how to lead discussion, how not to be afraid of controversial topics, how not to boot things out of the classroom when there are legitimate fears about parental backlash, about position insecurity. In in over half of the states in the U.S., teachers are no longer protected in being able to have rigorous freedom of speech, let's say. They're technically state actors, so they don't have a lot of freedom of speech to begin with. That's kind of a misperception. But my point is that you can now be, in the state where I live, for example, in Wisconsin, as a public school teacher, you can now be fired for any cause or no cause. It's a right to work state, which just means you don't have the right to say what you want, and if you get community backlash, you can lose your position. So I'm asking teachers to do things that they may well get in trouble for, but it's because I believe in teaching as a real profession. I should also mention that it's a tremendous challenge because, especially in the US, we're living in this neoliberal age of corporate educational reform, where we have more and more teachers who are less and less trained. So the number of Teach for America teachers who are coming into especially poor districts where we need well-trained teachers. I could go on at great length, but my point is only that we need great teachers to be able to do what I'm advocating for that I think comes out of research. So a challenge is that realistically, this is a pretty hard, idealistic program for US schools. A second major challenge is that we really have in the US multiple school systems. We're not a centralized system. We have state-based education. Even in states that have mandated Holocaust education, there isn't mandated content. There's a lot of complexity in the US. I don't in any way mean to imply that this is that there are two school systems, but we have very, very different school systems based on wealth. We have a hyper-capitalist system of education in the US. So wealthy schools have different curricula than poor schools. A poor school, which might be a failing school, in order to try to raise test scores, like so in Milwaukee, for example, in the state where I live, Milwaukee is a poor school district. It's a failing school district. So they've taken out of the curriculum everything that is not mandatorily tested. That means they've taken out of the curriculum history, because English, literacy, and math are tested. And so there's actually no social studies in the curriculum. There's also no recess, no art, no music. So that's a very different curriculum than at a wealthy school, let's say in a suburb of Chicago, where teachers will be paid much, much more, will have much higher spending per pupil, have much nicer facilities, and have a much more robust curriculum. Because in those wealthy schools, they have social studies, they have recess, they have art, they have band, they have school psychologists, things that in urban districts are unheard of. So one of the sad states of the U.S. writ large at the moment is that because of the attacks on public education and on teachers, what we have are these very different school settings where to be teaching about genocide at all is becoming a privileged position. So it hasn't happened yet, but it's. I was just talking to somebody who works at the Shoah Foundation and running by her this hunch I had that I think there's a real likelihood that we're having very, very different socioeconomic, class-based understandings of the Holocaust. And it's not, in this case, I'm talking about exposure alone. But forgetting exposure for a moment, even when you have teaching about the Holocaust in very different, because we have class-based segregated schools in some places, you end up with really very different understandings and different potentials for empathy. Okay, so that's another challenge. A third challenge is that these arguments I'm making position Holocaust education as a liberal, democratic project. And here I don't mean liberal as opposed to conservative in U.S. politics, but liberal in terms of the great traditions of liberal education. And so what I really mean is that this is a liberal project, and so people who don't believe in deliberation, who believe in particularist goals, are going to oppose this kind of positioning of Holocaust education. Does that make sense? So what's hopeful? Because, like the teacher I studied in the beginning, I really like to end on a happy note and have a silver lining. I'm American. No, I'm kidding. I mean, I am American. I'm not kidding about that. But here's what I'll say. So what is actually hopeful about these propositions? I actually think, I heard a lovely presentation this morning by Magda Gross, who was talking about how this morning there are fights within the history education community, the researchers on history education, about whether you need information at all, because it's all available through device. So, so what is it schools should be doing in this moment? One thing that I think of as being hopeful about these propositions for the way schooling ought to work, especially schooling about the Holocaust and genocide, is that I think if we embrace the idea that schools need to be places where our deepest values come into contact with people about whom we disagree profoundly and deeply, we're actually furthering a democratic project that is hopeful. It is not, you can call me naive, but please let me enjoy my naivete, because I actually really think it's a place where in the US we can have these hard conversations, and that we deserve to have them, and that it's a hope that we ought to have them. Schools ought to be places where all of those ideas are discussed. That obviously involves conflict, and I've heard it in multiple sessions this morning, and I think it's the nature of democratic living, or also non-democratic living, right? That we always have conflicting, contested narratives. And the question is, do we have particular narratives that trump others? On what basis? I'd rather not do that. I'd rather say, well, what's the historical evidence for any of these narratives? On what basis do we make them? And then what are the political usages? What are the moral messages that we deem appropriate, inappropriate? And that's actually what can happen in schools and can't happen easily elsewhere. That schools, in a way, because they're protected as spaces for political decision making, become ideal places to have these really contested discussions. And in fact, at least in the social studies literature, there are lots of formats, pedagogical formats, designed to help us figure out how to do that with kids. The bottom line is that context always matters. Always. I know you've heard that a lot today already, but I'm just going to say it again. It always matters. And what that means, not only in meaning making, not only in life, not only in research, but I think that means that when we do research, it always needs to be contextually based. It always needs to be attached profoundly to its context, which makes me argue for more fine-grained qualitative research, not only because I do that kind of research, but because I think that's a way of getting beyond survey research. But I'm not saying in any way that we don't need survey research too, or that we don't need grand empirical visions of what's happening where. We need combinations to give us deep post-holing and breadth. Okay, so pause, that's a joke. Get it, the pause? Sorry. I'm going to stop because it's been 37 minutes. And I want to invite you to turn to the person sitting next to you and introduce yourself with your name. And just pause for a moment. Are there any questions that were raised? Does it all sound familiar? Is there somewhere you want to push this discussion forwards? And that's where I'll stop. So thank you.